Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. It's been another stressful stretch of time for me where I'm having trouble catching up with things, so when that happens, I often wind up writing the month's video on a subject that comes easily to me. This one is based on a phrase that has for a long time rubbed me the wrong way, and I never really sat down to think about why until a friend of mine posted something on social media that rather got my hackles up. I wish I had saved it. I'm kicking myself over it now because I can't find it, but essentially it was a post that was critical of cognitive behavioral therapy because of the notion from that branch of psychology that feelings are not facts. The post effectively complained about the minimization of one's feelings and how they often mark a significant element of one's way of experiencing the world, and therefore, trying to brush them off as some mere trick of the mind is both invalidating and ineffective. Basically, the post can be concisely summarized in the phrase, "Your feelings are valid." Even to just say it feels so trite it sets my teeth on edge. I'm going to try to take my time and break this down in as many ways as possible so people don't misunderstand where my frustration is coming in. Let's start with the fact that cognitive behavioral therapy, and person-centered therapy, but we'll get to that in a second, marks the primary method of my counseling style, so I am quite familiar with several of the main thrusts of the model. Briefly, it focuses primarily on recognizing and challenging negative thought patterns or structures, for example, cognitive distortions like black and white thinking, catastrophizing, and, yes, emotional reasoning, and recognizing how these thought patterns impact one's behavior and the consequences of that. It then involves attempting to replace these unproductive thought patterns with more productive alternatives that lead to more realistic thinking and therefore more useful behaviors and better mental health overall. It's one of the most widely used forms of therapy for a reason. It's straightforward and often very effective, assuming you are able to pivot towards the needs of the client. That is, some may prefer more structure in psychoeducation. Some may prefer a more free-form or exploratory process, and some may just want tools to get better and GTFO. This is one of the reasons I also incorporate person-centered therapy into my methods. Again, briefly, this model essentially just focuses on creating an environment in which the client can feel unconditionally accepted with a therapist that is genuine and empathetic. You may notice that a focus on emotion or feelings doesn't exactly make up the bulk of these models, but like I said, if that's something the client wants to explore, I'm not going to tell them no. Or shall I say, tell them that that's an invalid concern. Now, I'm still relatively new at this. I'm not trying to claim that I'm some kind of pro or anything like that. Maybe there are CBT therapists that are dogmatically unwilling to allow for the discussion of emotions in their sessions. I don't know. I would say that's more of a reflection on them than anything else. Anyway, I didn't create this video to put on a Psych 101 course. Let's move along. So the cognitive distortion the article was ostensibly speaking about was the aforementioned emotional reasoning one, which is basically the idea that I feel it, therefore it is true. Now, the reason this is a cognitive distortion is because the way a person feels about something is very subjective and does not necessarily reflect the facts of their situation. For example, someone may very easily feel their partner doesn't love them or is being unfaithful, or that they did terrible on a final exam or evaluation, or they may feel like they aren't good enough for anything. But their feelings about the situation aren't necessarily reflective of reality. The person's spouse could be entirely devoted and faithful, they could have performed just fine on their evaluation, and they could be doing many things that objectively show they are, in many ways, good enough, but their feelings are leading them to be misled about their own circumstances. It does not mean that how one feels about something is meaningless, or that they shouldn't feel their feelings. On the contrary, one of the most effective exercises I often use in therapy is a mindfulness of emotions meditation exercise to directly confront and experience what those feelings are like in the moment. There are a few reasons why I do this. First, because in order to manage your feelings, you have to know them and to know what to look out for. Second, because if you're just trying to avoid confronting your feelings by bottling things up, often you'll wind up fixating on them more. Want an example? Take the next 2 minutes and think about anything you want, but whatever you do, don't think about a white elephant. Go ahead and pause this video and tell me after the fact if you were able to keep that elephant out of your mind even for a few seconds, let alone the full 2 minutes. Rigid fixation on trying to keep something out of mind is rarely an effective path to control. So, from the practice end, the post talking about CBT dismissing one's feelings is already off base. Let's now talk about the title statement directly. Your feelings are valid. What does that really even mean in the first place? Well, I would wager it's saying a bit more than just your feelings are real or your feelings are allowed to exist, since these are not only painfully obvious things to say and believe, but that they are not realistically things that anyone but the most emotion-devoid individual would disagree with. Instead, I'd argue that it's an assertion that feelings are a valid lens through which to examine one's experiences and viewpoints. This is a much more nuanced discussion to have. Let's pick an example scenario. Let's say we have a young adult male, early 20s. Let's call him Bob. Bob doesn't work a great job and so doesn't have a lot of money. He lives with his parents and doesn't have a lot of hobbies, partially due to his lack of finances and partially due to being hesitant to bring any friends to his parents' house. Bob has never had much luck with women in his life, and is currently single after being ghosted by someone he'd been on a few dates with. Bob is struggling with social anxiety and feels very forlorn and depressed about his situation. Now, let's say Bob laments to his sister about how he is feeling, and she responds with, "Your feelings are valid." Great, thanks. But now what? Sure, it may be valid for Bob to feel depressed about his continuing lack of success with women, or his poor job prospects, or lack of social independence. Maybe his sister is trying to tell him that he should be allowed to express his frustration freely to her rather than, bottling up his feelings and not talking about it, and that's fine. But it offers very little in the way of actually addressing anything or finding solutions. It doesn't tell Bob how to change anything about his situation so that he no longer has to feel depressed. In itself, it doesn't even really offer him much in the way of validation because it's not specifically addressing any of his actual experiences. But maybe this is a bad example, one might say. Let's try another one in what might be a more familiar context for this kind of phrase. Let's say a female student, Jessica, perceives something a fellow student or even the teacher says or does as being insensitive or threatening in some way. She tells a fellow classmate about her concerns, saying, "But maybe I'm just overreacting." But then her friend says, "Your feelings are valid." Now, what does this mean exactly? In this case, her friend may be just trying to say that Jessica is allowed to feel offended by whatever it was that was said. But Jessica may even take this a step further and perceive that her friend is validating her feelings themselves. That is, effectively telling her that her feeling offended by what was said was valid. But was it? Perhaps the student or teacher said something patronizing or sexist or tasteless. Maybe the teacher became unnecessarily harsh and dismissive toward one of Jessica's comments. Or perhaps the student simply presented an opposing opinion to Jessica or another woman in the class. Or, let's say the teacher began talking about a subject that Jessica was personally uncomfortable with and felt there should be some kind of prior content warning in advance of the lecture. Or maybe none of the above happened at all and Jessica just thought she heard something that in fact was never said at all. Regardless of which of these scenarios occurred, the end result of Jessica feeling offended is still the same. Would it then be fair to say her feelings are valid in each of these cases? Her friend may say so because she's obviously feeling the way she is for a reason, and being dismissive of that is missing an opportunity to make the classroom more inclusive or safe. On the other hand, maybe validating Jessica's offense when neither the student nor the teacher intended to cause harm in any way will actually result in Jessica feeling worse about the situation than she otherwise would have, by virtue of giving credence to the initially negative and emotional lens through which she viewed the situation. Perhaps if she was challenged and told that, no, in this case, perhaps your feelings weren't so valid, she might have realized she did, in fact, overreact to the situation, which may then cause her to react less defensively in the future. In both Bob and Jessica's case, the statement, "your feelings are valid," offered neither a solution to their concerns nor a particularly constructive way to address their experiences. At best, it is a relatively meaningless platitude that, I guess, opens up the door for them to feel free to express their thoughts to the person that said it, but at worst, it offers validation when what really might be more effective is the opposite approach. I've been seeing more people lately putting feelings on a pedestal and rallying against the idea that there may be scenarios in which feelings are not valid. Or worse, claiming in some way that the logical or systematic approach to looking at a scenario necessarily minimizes the feelings element. As a therapist, I of course leave space for the client to talk about their feelings if that's what they would like to talk about. There's no denying that sometimes it can just feel good to vent and get it all out there, so to speak. Also, I don't try to tell my clients their feelings aren't real or that they shouldn't exist in some way. I may gently point out scenarios where their feelings may be leading them to perceive a situation in a needlessly negative way, but most of the time my methods don't focus on the feelings themselves. Now, again, not focusing on them doesn't mean I don't consider them important. It just means I don't necessarily consider them to be the main element of change in therapy. Feelings are subjective and often quite difficult to control in and of themselves. Rather than trying to change the way someone feels about something, you can often get a lot farther by changing the way they think about it or the way they behave. Oftentimes by thinking differently about an experience or by doing things differently than they have been doing, this can change the way they feel about things. But even if it doesn't, at very least, my methods target something within the client's control, and it gives them tools they can actually use to affect change in their lives. After all, I find that people who are experiencing some kind of negative emotion due to something in their life rarely benefit from merely sitting and stewing on those emotions over a prolonged period of time. Believe it or not, things are usually more complicated than a trite little pat on the bum and a pithy saying would have you believe. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.